after completing his task, Mo Beijun turned around and left. Wow, this NPC really was so straight to the point, not a moment was spared, completely in line with his method of operation in the original work. He'd show up wherever Luo Binghe needed him without rhyme or reason. His actions were just that forced, a total maverick, needing not a shred of logic. Speaking of forced, that could only be how Shen Qingqiu would face his next task, the last level. Having fought a harsh battle, Luo Binghe was half kneeling in the midst of a ruined landscape, his eyes vacant, but it looked like his placid veneer would at any moment tear. Right now, his mind was like a dormant volcano, one that had suddenly erupted after being silent for many years, the magma in its veins starting to flow. Just thinking about this made Shen Qingqiu feel like he was burning up along with it, until his bones and head began to ache and pound. The system sent a shrill notification, the likes of which he'd never heard before. Warning! The critical quest, the endless abyss and endless hatred, a sky filled with crystal frost and tears of blood, has officially begun. If it is not successfully completed, 20,000 protagonist satisfaction points will be deducted. Was it Shen Qingqiu's imagination, or were the quest names getting more and more absurd every time, to the point that Shen Qingqiu didn't even know where to begin roasting them? And hey, when I confirmed with you a while back, wasn't it 10,000? Hasn't it been like 5 minutes and now it's doubled? Swaying, Shen Qingqiu walked over to Luo Binghe, who was still in a half-crazed state. He unleashed a couple of palm strikes on his back, channeling some of his own remaining spiritual energy into his student's body. Not only did Luo Binghe fail to regain consciousness, the demonic qi within his body rebounded Shen Qingqiu's efforts, forcing Shen Qingqiu to cough up the mouthful of blood he'd been holding back for so long. Only at this moment did Luo Binghe finally recover some awareness. He slowly pulled himself out of his muddled state and managed to piece together a couple of mangled words. The familiar face also gradually came into focus. Shen Qingqiu saw Luo Binghe's gaze clear a bit and let out a sigh of relief. He wiped at the blood by his mouth and asked in an even tone, "You're awake?" After a pause, "If you're awake, let's have a thorough discussion. Luo Binghe, tell me honestly, exactly how long have you been practicing demonic cultivation?" As soon as he said this, it was as if Luo Binghe had been plunged from the stifling upper heavens into a bone-chilling pool. It would have been impossible for him to not return to complete consciousness. He stared at Shen Qingqiu's wintry face, and his heart sank straight down. In the past, Shen Qingqiu always called him Binghe. He had never been addressed by his full name. "Shizun," he said quietly. "This disciple can explain." Though Luo Binghe was still a youth, he'd always remained calm and unperturbed, often acting mature beyond his years. Now, actual panic surfaced on his face, like he was frantic to explain but didn't know where to start. Seeing the oh-so-mighty male lead reduced to this state, Shen Qingqiu couldn't stand to watch anymore. He burst out to cut him off. "Silence!" His voice had only just left his mouth, and he already felt like he hadn't properly controlled himself, that his tone had been overly harsh. He seemed to have scared Luo Binghe. The boy stared at him blankly, with pitch-black eyes, like a child who'd been slapped, muddled, confused, and indeed he obediently went silent. "When did you start?" Shen Qingqiu stiffly recited the line, unable to harden his heart enough to look his student in the eyes. 2 years ago. Shen Qingqiu went silent and didn't speak. To answer his question so quickly and so honestly to boot, it seemed Luo Binghe really was scared witless. Unbeknownst to him, Luo Binghe automatically took the silence to mean, Is that so, you wicked disciple? You managed to hide this from me for so long. 2 years, Shen Qinqiu said quietly. No wonder you were able to progress by leaps and bounds to such an extent. You truly live up to your reputation, Luo Binghe. You are gifted with spectacular talent. In truth, these words he spoke were truly an expression of the regrets within his heart. As a male lead, Luo Binghe was indeed blessed with spectacular talent. If Shen Qinqiu had to describe what he was feeling with absolute honesty, it was admiration with the tiniest bit of envy. But to Luo Binghe's ears, his meaning was completely different. He instantly fell to his knees before Shen Qinqiu. Shen Qinqiu's soul almost left his body. If a man kneeling was worth his weight in gold, the male lead kneeling was worth your life. Letting him kneel at this critical juncture, when Luo Binghe remembered it in the future, wouldn't his hatred be compounded? Get up! Shen Qinqiu waved his sleeve at once. Hit by the gust from this wave, Luo Binghe couldn't help but stand again and back up a few steps, even more stunned out of his senses. Had he done something wrong? Something so wrong that it couldn't be absolved, that he didn't even have the right to kneel and plead Shizun for forgiveness? But Shizun, you said before that just as people can be good or bad, demons can be good or evil, he mumbled. That in this world there is no one intolerable to the heavens. I said that? It had been many years, Shen Qinqiu thought intently for a while. It seemed like he really had said that. But that had been in the past, when he'd been considering a far-off future. This was now, in the midst of a crisis with a blade suspended above his throat. This was a last resort, but would it be too shameless to slap his own face by doubling down? You are no simple demon, Shen Qinqiu said. That mark on your forehead is a mark of sin, the mark of the demons who fell from the heavens. These demons have murdered countless humans, and moreover, their temperaments are impossible to contain. From ancient times, they've been the cause of calamity upon calamity. Under no circumstances can they be spoken of in the same breath as other demons. I cannot wait and hope my earlier words were true while you develop a taste for slaughter and lose all control. As these words touched his ears, Luo Binghe's hopes shattered, and the rims of his eyes reddened. His voice quivered. But you said... I said a lot of things, okay? I even once made several hundred posts in bright red font about wanting to castrate Shen Qinqiu. Well, sorry, it wasn't the least bit funny right now. Shen Qinqiu, who'd always been so good at mental gymnastics, reached a new high in his number of mental roasts, madly smashing through his old records. Yet, he still couldn't put himself at ease, and instead, he only grew more tired and worn out. He relentlessly told himself to the point of auto-brainwashing. The suffering and torment Luo Binghe endured now was all necessary in order for him to stand above the masses in the future. Without enduring the bone-chilling cold, how could fragrant plum blossoms hope to bloom? Without 3 years' training in the realms below, how could a demon king over worlds loom? With the claiming of Xingmo sword in hand, he would possess everything beneath the heavens. With a harem innumerable, he need not to be an incel. But it was useless. It was completely useless. Nothing could lift his spirits. Shen Qinqiu raised his head and formed a sword seal to summon Xiuya, and he held it within his hand. The hand wielding the sword shook slightly, thin veins surfacing through his skin. Shizun, you really want to kill me? Luo Binghe couldn't believe it. I don't want to kill you. Unable to look at his expression, Shen Qinqiu's gaze went straight through him. Luo Binghe searched his memory, but he had never seen Shen Qinqiu so cold and emotionless, not toward him. Even back when he'd just entered Changchong Mountain sect, when Shizun had disliked him, his eyes had never been this empty, as if he was looking at nothing. His gaze held not even a trace of warmth. It was exactly the way he looked at heinous demons whom he had executed with the same sword. "It's only what that man said wasn't wrong," said Shen Qingqiu. "The human realm is no longer a place for you. You ought to return to the place you belong." Shen Qingqiu pressed him backward until they were right on the edge of the endless abyss. If one looked into the ravine, they would see the simmering demonic qi roiling unceasingly within it, and they would hear the anguished wailing of tens and thousands of spirits. Hundreds and thousands of deformed arms reached up from the cracks towards the human realm, hungering for fresh blood and flesh. The deeper regions faded into black fog and eerie scarlet light. "Will you go down yourself, or must I force you?" Shen Qingqiu asked, Shouya's sword pointing towards the abyss. He selflessly hoped that Luo Binghe would go on his own volition. In this kind of scenario, characters who chose to jump from cliffs were always caught on something. Then Shen Qingqiu could go on believing his own lies that this scene would have a happy end. Better that than this moment being carved into Shen Qingqiu's memory from here on out, forcing him to remember night and day that he had shoved Luo Binghe down with his own two hands. But Luo Binghe refused to give up hope. He refused to believe that the teacher who had been so kind to him would actually hurt him. He refused to believe that all those years of companionship every day, morning to night, could lead to this conclusion. Even as Shouya's sword stabbed into Luo Binghe's chest, he clung to a last strand of hope. Shen Qingqiu hadn't meant to stab him. He really hadn't. He was only steeling himself, waving his sword around in order to scare Luo Binghe. If Luo Binghe had stepped back once more to avoid his swings, he'd naturally fallen in. Shen Qingqiu had never predicted that Luo Binghe would simply silently stand there, taking the blade head on. It was all over. The original work, Luo Binghe was only kicked into the abyss. Now there was this extra stab to add to his grudge. Luo Binghe lifted his hand to grip the blade, but he didn't use any of his strength and only lightly held it. If Shen Qingqiu decided to exert force, Shouya's sword would continue to stab into him until it pierced straight through his chest. Luo Binghe's throat lightly bobbed. He said not a single word. The blade point clearly hadn't pierced his heart, yet Shen Qingqiu felt like he could feel the heart's pained thumps traveling up the blade and into his hand, spreading through his entire arm until they arrived directly at his own heart. Shen Qingqiu suddenly withdrew the sword. With that action, Luo Binghe's body swayed a little, but he quickly steadied himself. Realizing that Shen Qingqiu hadn't dealt him a killing blow, his eyes, which had dimmed faintly, shone once more, like sparks struggling within burnt ashes. The corner of his mouth also managed to twitch. Perhaps he was trying to smile. But then Shen Qingqiu unleashed one final strike, which extinguished the last trace of light within Luo Binghe's eyes. He knew he would never forget Luo Binghe's expression from the moment of his fall. By the time the sect leaders and other cultivators arrived, having finished clearing out the demons within Juedi Gorge, the spatial rift caused by the endless abyss had long since closed. Other than Shang Qinghua, who was playing dead, Shen Qingqiu had stabilized the injuries of everyone who'd passed out, but he hadn't really paid attention to his own. His robe splattered with blood, his face expressionless and stark white. He looked quite wretched. Yue Qingyuan stepped forward to check Shen Qingqiu's pulse and condition, then frowned and asked Mu Qingfan, as the expert, to examine him. The cultivators of each sect picked out their disciples from among the bodies scattered across the ground, then whisked them away for further treatment. Liu Qingge sensed that they were short of one person. Then he realized it was a person who was always flitting around Shen Qingqiu, impossible to miss. "Where's that disciple of yours?" he asked. Head lowered, Shen Qingqiu didn't answer. He picked up the shattered pieces of a long sword lying on the ground, which had broken into many fragments. Qingjing Peak's disciples had hurried to the scene. The sharp-eyed Mingfan, who had been leading them, looked at the sword and stammered, "Shizun, that sword can't be." Mingfan had yearned for Zhenyang's sword on Wanjian Peak, and he had spent many years thinking about it. After Luo Binghe had claimed it, his entire body had burned with envy, and for many nights he'd cursed while tossing and turning. He definitely couldn't miss it. Ning Yingying let out a sudden loud wail. "Shizun, don't scare me. Is that Luo's Zhenyang? It can't be right. It can't be." A wave of whispers flowed around them. "Zhenyang? They're talking about Peak Lord Shen's beloved disciple Luo Binghe? A sword shares its existence with its master. If the sword is broken, then where is he? Could he have, Someone sighed. If this is really what happened, that's truly a great pity. In the midst of all this, Luo Binghe had become the Immortal Alliance Conference top ranker. Heaven envies talent, heaven envies talent! There were those who sighed in pity, those who were stunned, those who were sorrowful, and those who rejoiced in the misfortune of others. Ning Yingying burst into wailing tears on the spot. Though Mingfan hated Luo Binghe and was always cursing at him to die, he'd never really wanted him dead. Moreover, when he thought about how much Shizun had adored him and how this shitty brat had died without even leaving a corpse, Shizun had to be terribly sad, and Mingfan couldn't be happy about it either. Gloom and anxiety fell over the entirety of Qingjing Peak's delegation. Xianshu Peak's group of women, with Qi Qingqi as their head, were also deeply moved. Though Qingge wasn't good with words, he patted Shen Qingqiu's shoulder. Your disciple is gone, but you can still accept more." Though he knew Liu Qingge was trying to comfort him, Shen Qingqiu still wanted to feebly roll his eyes at him. People who hadn't kicked their favorite disciples, who was also the male lead, into the endless abyss were all just commentating from sidelines. Whatever. What's done is done. Qingjing Peak's disciple, Luo Binghe, Shen Qingqiu said slowly, fell to the demons and perished.